Okay, part 3 of this topic, we're going to talk about necropolitics and Gore Capitalism. Essentially, these concepts are going to be used to segue into the last couple of weeks of the course, where we're talking about very large-scale global inequalities, problems of waste, problems of sustainability, and also problems in terms of, who lives and who dies and who kind of can have a satisfying life and who can't, who is exposed to the risks of global capitalism in terms of the physical, labour and that kind of stuff. So it's a kind of segue section from that to the next. I thought I'd just kind of start with this thing here to kind of think a little bit about the politics of what I'm talking about here. As the earlier parts of this section have kind of pointed out, our governments, our corporations, our bureaucracies, our infrastructure have huge influence on who lives and who dies. It sounds kind of extreme, but it's just so normal, the fact that some people die, some groups of people die more than others, some people are exposed to sickness more than others, that we don't really even think about it too much. So this is kind of a humorous but really a kind of pretty accurate take on the politics of COVID, for instance. Governments not really funding hospitals. Our hospitals are run down. They struggle to keep up with the pandemic stuff, but will protect you from the threat of Afghan refugees, the real threat or whatever. So, this is kind of relating here to some of the absurdities of the way our politics play on fears that don't really kind of have much to do with our actual comforts and safety or risks of our day-to-day lives, and are kind of acting very much as a smokescreen for business as usual. So, firstly, I want to briefly introduce the idea of necropolitics. It comes from Mbembe, a social theorist from Cameroon, now I think in South Africa. Necropolitics is essentially a conceptual way of thinking about that very notion, who gets to live, who gets to die. Mbembe is particularly interested in how the state functions around this. Governments decide this, but I think it's useful to extend this to think about the ways that infrastructure and consumption, certainly things that are controlled in some ways by governments as well, but not as under control, can be thought under this kind of, I think really interesting and very useful concept. So Mbembe kind of thinks about something like US drone strikes. It's they're illegal, but the UN can't stop the US from doing anything, so they just kind of do this stuff with impunity. Now what happens there is that people in Newcastle aren't under the threat of drone strikes, but if you're in a country where that's the case, there's a very real risk that you'll die as a kind of collateral damage, innocent civilian death, but as long as they got the bad guy, it doesn't really matter.
All of the other things that compose of your social life will be damaged. For example, the school will be blown up.
Yeah,
the
infrastructure.
Highway,
the infrastructure
railway,
itself.
the
Yeah,
port
that's right.
in Mogadishu or wherever will be blown up. So yeah, it's and of course that collateral is then plunges people into poverty, reduces their livelihood capacity. So accelerates their death, and so I think that's also part of it too. Is not the direct killing, but also the destruction. That means some groups' life chances are significantly reduced.
That's right, and it's not just the death. As Mbembe points out, it's the threat of death.
Yes,
the kind of living under this constant, I suppose, atmosphere of the idea that you could die at any instant. Largely out of your own hands and out of your own control, and certainly out of your own government's control or whatever. So he kind of talks about this kind of constant exposure to, to death and destruction and illegitimate death and destruction. Not sure there is legitimate, but if you know what I mean here, it instills a kind of zombie existence of precarity for these people. And again, we're talking about people that what we're calling the majority world here, that's sometimes called the third world or developing world, but this is places that are kind of exploited, consumer capitalism. It's where the mining's done, it's where the production's done, it's where the dumping of waste's done. They're kind of stuck in these kind of places between life and death. So again, referring back to things like sovereignty, we're kind of under the standing that our governments, don't break laws, that they kind of look after people, that they, don't invade other places, but really this stuff is happening all the time. I think, Obama broke the record for the most drone deaths, and that's a kind of, a Democrat president, a kind of apparently not a hawk president. So, importantly though, while people that are exposed to kind of pointy end of necropolitics live in this kind of living dead, for us in the kind of much more safe north, we have no real kind of possibility of understanding what that's like. It's just a complete distance, and really, the only way we are exposed to it is through media, and if it becomes this kind of morbid spectacle for us to kind of consume. So, necropolitics, very broadly, it's kind of who decides who lives and dies. Of course, what Mbembe is showing here is that people that in the majority world, particularly there's lots of racial, ethnic, religious kind of inequalities here that are part of who decides or who dies. Building on this, Valencia has coined the term Gore Capitalism. So Valencia is a Mexican transfeminist theorist, builds on the idea of necropolitics to argue that violence itself is key to understanding what can be called Gore Capitalism. So here, and we'll talk about this in future weeks as well, violence isn't some kind of outlier, spectacular event of the system. It's central to it. So again, for Valencia, this is an undisguised price paid for those outside global north for being part of global capitalism. And the undisguised thing there is important. We know this stuff's going on. It's on the news, right? But we just kind of get on with it. So she makes some really interesting points here that I think speak to a lot of the things we've been talking on in the course in terms of infrastructure, law, consumption, technology, and again, like Truscello, about how this is kind of something that's consumed through media and pop culture and things like that. So she talks about how, for instance, the tortured, mutilated or dead bodies of things like, Mexican drug cartels or the police officers trying to do something about it are consumed as little more than spectacle in the global north. Where importantly, that's where the billion-dollar market for things like cocaine are. So the kind of side effects of like death and violence are largely kind of rendered out of the place where these kind of black market things are consumed. And what I really like about this as well, I think it's a really savvy piece of analysis, is the term black market isn't a coincidence. It's not just a colloquial term for illegalities. She kind of points out that it holds associations with black and brown people, and that those in the north tend to kind of look down upon, don't trust, exploit. That exploitation is therefore part of one's own material privilege. And there's a kind of, they bring it on themselves kind of thing here. They wouldn't be involved in this kind of illegal activity if, they weren't better people or whatever. Again, this kind of completely renders out the actual structural circumstances of these people's lives.
I think what's interesting too, what can sometimes be missing from this too, is the role in which kind of middle and upper class people within these societies play in this perpetuation as well. It's still removed from their lives too in secure apartments and gated communities, and they'll often vote for politicians who promise this kind of eradication to make their life safer, etc. We've seen it in the Philippines, we've seen it in Mexico, we've seen it in, see it in Colombia, for example, that this sort of the same rhetoric that animates leaders in the global north about stamping out terrorism or killing drug dealers or stopping them also appeals to people from particular backgrounds within those countries too, which keeps some of these politicians in power and being re-elected as well. And so there's this idea about how that class of people also then leaks into the kind of, got much more affinity with people in the global north than they do with their own people who inhabit their own cities and towns as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say in terms of places like Australia, the same middle class people that will get snooty about people using plastic bags or going to eat at McDonald's will have no problem kind of taking cocaine. Right? Yes. You can't take cocaine sustainably or ethically. So that's a kind of hypocrisies I want to point out here. Is just and I think this Valencia work is really good. Is that our own privilege here? There's all kind of status systems with drug taking within a country. Taking ice on the street is seen as much more worse than kind of taking cocaine in your bathroom with your fellow kind of professional friends. That's always the case. But there's a further kind of element of ethics and morals being laid on here by Valencia. I think it's really important. That enjoyment you're having, is relied upon the kind of dead bodies that are on the screen there. So, in terms of consumerism's necropolitics, while Mbembe focus on the state, I think it's interesting to think about consumer capitalism and draw on some of these examples so far in the course already and look at it a little bit more later in the course. There's there's young boys in the Congo mining coltan who, you know, are dying in horrible conditions, or at least being put into slave labour, and the worker suicides at Foxconn that I'll kind of look on next week, where, you know, rather than change the working conditions, they put up nets at the bottom of the buildings to try and catch the people jumping off that were trying to kill themselves. There's sweatshop labour that's just constantly been a thing. We don't hear as much anymore from the 90s kind of anti-globalisation movements, but still certainly a thing. There's the collateral damage in wars. Many of the wars, you know, that we're talking about, particularly through the 90s and 2000s, were about oil, right? So they're about very much the infrastructure and the fuel for our consumption. There's the human trafficking around slave and sexual labour. There's the chemical dumping of our waste in the global south, where, you know, that obviously has effects on who gets sick and who doesn't. So, you know, I think this is a particularly good line. Mbembe talks about how the calculus of life passes through the death of the other. These kind of risks are passed on. We don't really need to have to deal with them. And
then you can also see why people have this urge to then try and consume differently. You know, even with a bit of knowledge of this, but their agency to do so is often still very limited. You know, you want to buy the stuff that's just grown down the road, or you want to buy clothes that someone makes in a thing. But yeah, I think that it's for most people, that's a privilege to be able to do.
Absolutely,
it's very difficult.
And again, I don't want to kind of talk about other people here. I want to do that.
Yes, I know.
And I feel guilty about not doing that sometimes, and all the kind of things. Like it's easy for us to talk about other people.
Yes.
But once, you know, as you pointed out throughout the course, we're entangled in this stuff. It's not really something you can just kind of make a kind of individual agentic decision to opt out of and do other things, because we're bound up in this infrastructure and systems.
And I think that's the necropolitics of infrastructure for us, right? The more it's connected, the more it's necropolitics, a part of our own agency and actions.
Yeah, and our way of lives are kind of not determined by it, but bound up in it, and therefore it's hard to kind of escape.
Yes.
Chaliaki's work has been quite prominent, thinking about the mediated relations here. Her work on spectatorship of suffering and her work on ironic spectators, I think, is a good way to think about our subject position, you know, in the global north. She talks about how we either do or don't react to this. You know, we can feel bad about watching on the news. We see earthquakes, tsunamis, famines. We see, you know, massacres in drug cartels and all this kind of stuff. It's just mediated to us really largely as another form of entertainment. Like, so, you know, back to Baudrillard talking about, you know, the news becomes entertainment and simulations and hyperreality and all that kind of thing. She fundamentally kind of engages with, like, the very possibility of us having any real emotions about this when it's just kind of funneled through media and our social media or whatever. She talks at length about the notion of compassion fatigue, the audience's gradual disinterest from suffering. And you can see that even this with the coronavirus now, there's still the same amount of people dying every day as we record this as there was a year ago, but like, we're not even talking about it anymore. So, spectators are confronted with a diffused and often confusing collage of sufferings, each seeking to make its own bid for public attention, while it offers them no rational way of weighing the claims against each other. In making it impossible to judge which different suffering matters the most, the media create an ethical vacuum in the voice of justice, and in this way, what may create compassion fatigue and may inhibit action. So it's kind of, there's all these competing sufferings. You know, you see ads for it now. There's Save the Children, and, you know, and all these kind of things that are kind of demanding our attention to pay money for this kind of stuff. But there's so many of them that people, from this perspective, kind of feel helpless and therefore don't really do anything. So she kind of, in later work, calls this the kind of ironic spectator, and we can maybe relate this back to the hipster somewhat as well. The ironic spectator is separated from the reality of the lives of the precarious. The necropolitics relation here is that, you know, we get to live, others die. Such spectators can feel empathy and anger about injustices to the extent that they may, you know, write a kind of angry Facebook post or buy a Save the Whales band, or, you know, maybe give $5 a week to a charity. But they just generally then get on their own lives. They certainly don't kind of adjust their lives too much or make any sacrifices. This has little to no chance of making any changes. So essentially, what the ironic spectator from this point of view is Chaliaki's way of thinking about Western subjectivity generally. When it comes to politics and consumerism, so I think that makes a lot of sense in many ways, but I would also say that in the West, what we call the West, the Ironic Spectator isn't really everyone as well. I mean, if you're an African American at the time of the George Floyd thing in a city in the US, your distance of Ironic Spectatorship from this kind of Gore politics or Necropolitics isn't the same as kind of a white person in that same place. So,
and I think same with diaspora and migrant communities. Something happens back home, but back home is also entangled in their own lives in a way that shortens that distance of other in that sense. And so, for example, I know that from Afghan friends here, when the Taliban came back into rule in 2021, there was a lot of we need to raise money, we need to do this, we need to do that, etc., which is important. But they weren't caring about what happened in Gambia, for example. They were caring about what happened back home for them. So I think that's also there's a familiarity there, and I think what the media has done is it's brought other people's suffering into our lives, whereas in a previous era, the only suffering we saw was around us, or people we knew, or contacts we had, or through faith communities, or through religious groups, or whatever we understood of other people's suffering. Whereas now the spectacle's enlarged, and our capacity for action has shrunk in that sense. And so action often only takes place in ways that can be quite visible. So the refugees have moved in down the road, or that are, rather than facing the conflict that's letting them flee. And I think that the scale of it all is so disrupted, and I think that's a really important point that comes out of this too, is that we're given a window into things that we can't possibly imagine we could ever control or have a say in, with the exception of the standard ones of lobbying our government to do to take different action, etc.
Yeah, and a few things about that I would say is that, like, if you're viewing that kind of stuff, I get the impression that people have more emotional reactions to a Netflix show than they do to something on the news. So it kind of gets thrown about in this kind of same like media milieu, for example, but like, emotional orientation towards it is one thing, I suppose.
Do you think that the way we view has changed this? So whereas maybe everyone watched, or a large proportion watched, the same news broadcast 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock every night, we now get our information through such a different number of sources. We're not all seeing the same suffering in that sense. We're certainly we're seeing none of it.
I think it's more likely that people are seeing much less of it now because of that as well. So I'd also say something in terms of the Ironic Spectator and the kind of ambivalence of doing anything, is that what's also happening in the kind of, global north is that people up the kind of class scale, well into the kind of upper middle classes, are also feeling more precarious and anxious than ever before in their own subject positions.
That's a very good point.
Professional jobs now are insecure, where in previous there was security. So there's this kind of sense for the people that maybe could do something about it, could sacrifice some money, could do all this kind of thing themselves, feel at risk of kind of like under dangers, have their lifestyle, or have their security, have their house, their career under risk all the time because, nothing's permanent anymore. So I'm not making a moral argument and say that's fair enough, but I think there's actually understandings here for why that subject position in the West isn't maybe as generous or as empathetic as it could be because of this kind of rising precarity. And I'll talk about some aspects of that in a future week when I talk about your happiness and satisfaction in terms of this course.
Yeah, that's a great point. A great one to end on.
Thanks.
I mean, a sad one to end on.
Yeah.
A good point to end on.
A linking one to future weeks.
Yeah.